Hello guys, this is your friend and we are back with the new fanfic. And if you enjoy the fanfic, then please press the like button and subscribe to my channel for more fanfic like this. And now let's start the fanfic.
What if Naruto discovered the Uzumaki legacy early and became Princess Hinata's first friend? Chapter 1. Laughter bubbled in the air along with the short sharp crackle of handheld firecrackers mixing with the variety of colored lights all around Naruto. It would look even better at night, he was sure of it. Children younger and older than him ran all along the crowded streets of Konoha. Their laughter and joy mixing with the rest. Naruto was momentarily distracted by the decorative pinwheels several of the passing children had spinning in their hands. Its colorful ribbons an enchanting sight for the young boy. Another group of children passed by moving from street vendor to street vendor or stopping for a little while at a puppet theater. Naruto hadn't gotten around to visiting any of the puppet shows just yet. Nor had he spent the time to figure out which of the street vendors was giving away toys. But he had time. From what Naruto had heard of the festival, this was just the prelude to all of the real excitement. The festivities would get bigger and louder to the point that all of Konoha would be involved. He knew the last to be a fact as he'd been able to enjoy some of the festivities at its height while he was still stuck at the orphanage. Two young girls that Naruto had seen in the park before passed him. They were holding pretty fans and new toys, wearing nice-looking kimonos. In fact, everyone seemed to be in their kimonos today. Naruto looked down at his plain white t-shirt and worn blue pants he'd had to cut to fit him. Maybe he should have tried to find one as well. The sound of the pink-haired girl, cherry blossoms running the length of her pink kimono, brought Naruto back to focus. "Come on Ino-chan," she whined as she grabbed a hold of her blonde-haired friend. "We have to get good seats for the fireworks." "All right Sakura-chan." The blonde, Ino apparently, conceded as she allowed her pink-haired friend to pull her along. Her blue flower petal print kimono was just as pretty as her friend's pink one. For a moment Naruto felt envious of their colorful garb. My, don't you girls look lovely?" A nearby vendor stopped the two girls as they passed. "Thank you Ji-san, my mother bought it just for today," Sakura replied as she twirled around in her kimono, short pink hair flowing freely in the wind. "So did mine," Ino replied. Not to be outdone, she twirled around just a touch faster than her pink-haired companion and nearly stumbled into the old street vendor from the dizzy spell it caused. "Then before you go, why not have a snack too?" the old man replied as he bent over to give the young girls each a yakitori nearly as big as their heads. "Thanks Ji-san," the girls replied together before wandering off in a fit of giggles. "You two have fun," the old man yelled out to their retreating forms, a small smile on his face. Naruto's own stomach growled loudly and his mouth began to water at the smell of the yummy food. He'd been watching this particular vendor long enough to know he'd been handing out food to other children running around as well. Naruto had already passed up several other vendors who only gave extras to paying customers. He'd been just about to give up on finding a vendor actually giving away some of his food, figuring it has been something the other orphans had made up as they'd been known to do. But Naruto was glad he'd kept looking because he'd finally found one. This was his best chance. Naruto slipped from out of the shadows as the two girls disappeared in the crowd. "Hey Ji-san," Naruto called out to the vendor. "What do you want?" the old man spat, venom lacing his words. "Ah, I saw you giving away yakitori. Can I have some too?" Naruto asked, only mildly hesitant at the less than warm reception he'd received. "I'm not giving away my goods to something like you. Get out of here before I call the police," the old man threatened, his left hand coming up to form a fist as if he might use it to further ward off Naruto. "But it's my birthday." Naruto trailed off in disappointment. The vendor turned his back on Naruto and moved his cart down the street. "Temi," Naruto whispered to himself. Still, He knew how to handle Temura like him. At least he'd asked first. Gigi couldn't get mad at that. Naruto's laughter could be heard echoing off the alley walls. His voice coming from every direction and no direction all at once. He sunk into the shadows as two shinobi ran past him. They would be following echoes for a while, certainly long enough for Naruto to disappear. Once they had gone far enough away for Naruto to leave his hiding place, he moved on in the opposite direction. His stomach growling as he walked. At least he'd found a solution for his growling stomach. The golden rays of the fading sun shone brightly through her open window. The orange and red tints painting her pale surroundings a multitude of hues. If she took a moment to focus, she could just barely make out the faint buzz of the festival's activities happening in the distance. Hinata stood absolutely still as Mizumi-san finished tying the pale lavender obi of her dress kimono. While she was released early from her modified lessons to prepare for the yearly festival roaring just in the distance, she did not expect to attend any of the events. Well, that is expect for one, the most important event. The Hyuga parade and the fireworks that followed it. Despite the fact that she would most definitely be missing out on the largest, most important festival of the year, she was not sad or disappointed. No Hyuga, let alone the Yotsugi, ever felt sadness or disappointment. At least if they did, they never let it show. Those were simply emotions better left expressed by the common members of their great village. Definitely unfit for any Hyuga to express, a fact that was doubly so for her, the Yotsugi. This was just the way things were. Since her earliest memory, her life had always been this way, spent not so much in seclusion, but surrounded by family, the clan. They were the Hyuga, proud, strong and the single most important family in the village. So no, she wasn't sad that she'd never once participated in the festivities that she could hear softly in the distance. How could she wish for something that she'd never once experienced? Lost in her own thoughts, Hinata almost missed the soft cadence of one of her newest retainers. Yotsugi Dono, I have finished preparing you for the festival, Mizumi-san announced, head bowed in deference as she spoke. Thank you, Mizumi-san. You are dismissed, Hinata spoke gently yet firmly, just as Otu-sama had taught her. The Yotsugi should never sound meek or submissive after all. Generally speaking, there wasn't a lot of room for that type of behavior within the clan itself. Mizumi-san bowed again as she slowly backed out of the room, never once turning her back to Hinata. She was nice enough, but she was no Tatsuki-san. As she was quickly finding out, there were few people like Tatsuki-san. Turning to face her one window, Hinata fought the urge to sigh. Despite the fact that no one was currently with her, she refrained from losing control of her emotions. She may not be able to see anyone watching, but that didn't mean she was truly alone. She'd made that mistake only once. She didn't plan on making it again. As Otu-sama always said, behave as if someone is watching because someone always is. Hinata stared out her window as she waited. She wasn't entirely sure how long she'd have to wait this time, but that didn't faze her. Despite her young age, she had already learned to be patient. That had been the first important lesson her Otu-sama had taught her. While he often made her wait to test that lesson in patience, he wasn't above making her wait as a punishment, a factor that was heavily dependent on his mood. However, given the fact that she'd finally seen past the 500-meter mark today with her Byakugan, he was probably in a pretty good mood. Of course, they'd skipped the majority of her regular lessons to focus on her Byakugan training, so maybe he hadn't been all that impressed with something she was bound to get right today anyway. Either way, she didn't bother herself by worrying over the wait. Her Otu-sama would come get her eventually. It wasn't like she could miss the festival completely. She had a fairly important part to play today. Reishi, it is time for us to depart, Otu-sama said immediately, not wasting any time after opening the door to her room. Pleasantries were reserved for civilian diplomats only. Hinata turned without speaking, as a response to his simple statement would have been seen as extraneous, useless chatter, and followed in the shadow of her Otu-sama as he headed down the corridor. Slightly behind and to the right of the man, she held her head high. She was more than ready to take her place beside Otu-sama on the main platform. "Remember what I have taught you," he began without so much as a glance her way as they approached the raised platform together. "Use your chakra to stay standing. You are Reishi. You will stand tall beside me," he continued as they stepped onto the dais. Determined, she took her place in front of him. Today was her day. She was the one on display. "I will not disappoint you, Otu-sama," she thought as several branch members began to raise the platform. She stood tall and unmoving, head held high because she was smart enough to read between the lines. Should she fail in this simple task, then tomorrow would be another long day. And she really did want a chance to play in the gardens with Ka-san tomorrow. Naruto settled down as he walked to the quieter districts. He was glad the Hyuga-san hadn't been after him today. While he had quickly perfected how to escape regular ninja, he'd yet to figure out how to fool them. For whatever reason, they always seemed to catch him. Still, Naruto was optimistic. There had been a moment the last time he'd been running from the Hyuga-san that he could have sworn they'd not seen him. He had no doubt he'd get it eventually. He was definitely onto something. Naruto shook his head, for that was for a later time. For now, he was simply glad they were too busy with the big parade preparations. At least he thought they were. Naruto couldn't be sure, but the other orphans had said they were the biggest part of the parade. So, he supposed that meant they would be in it. The Hyuga were the biggest clan in the village, so that kind of meant they had to be, right? Today was, after all, the celebration of all celebration. The defeat of the nine-tailed beast, the Kyuubi, by the Yondaime. He knew the story well. What kid didn't? The Yondaime sacrificing his life to defeat that vile beast, it was just too amazing and heroic to forget. So, today Konoha celebrated, both the life of the Yondaime and the defeat of the tailed beast. This would be the 6th annual celebration, and strangely enough, it was also Naruto's 6th birthday. Despite the fact that this celebration had been happening for 6 straight years, the duration of his entire life, Naruto had never before been allowed to participate. His handlers at the orphanage had never allowed it. But now, he was on his way to becoming a Konoha ninja. He was far too old and responsible to be living in an orphanage. So he was excited, more than excited. Naruto might have to miss the majority of the festival because of his earlier food misunderstanding, but he'd at least get to see the parade and the fireworks. Even if that was the only event he'd be able to see, he was more than glad to be seeing it. Naruto's stomach growled again, reminding him of how hungry he was. Plopping down under a nearby tree, he unwrapped his score. 4 yakitori that the old man had just been giving away, along with several onigiri and sticky dango on sticks. It was a feast like none he'd ever seen. Despite being glad to be out of the orphanage, Naruto hadn't realized how hard it would be for the future greatest shinobi of Konoha to find food. He didn't like stealing, but this wasn't really stealing. The man was giving most of it away, anyway. So, Naruto was just taking his share along with the additional price for being a jerk. It wasn't like he was going to do this again or anything like that. Naruto nodded his head at his own pep talk as he took a large bite of one of his sticky dango sticks. Normally he'd have gone to the back of a restaurant. They always throw away perfectly good food. Still, today was different. He was 6, and today would be the first time he'd get to see the fireworks out in the open. It was a special day, and special days required something as equally special to go along with it. Besides, the village was celebrating. While the celebration around him wasn't really his, he couldn't help but feel that the fireworks, the puppet shows, the paper dragon kites, and the food vendors were all for him. The whole village was celebrating the birth of the greatest shinobi. They were even throwing him a parade. However, this wasn't just any parade. Naruto had heard stories from the other children in the orphanage how amazing this parade was. This parade was to be like no other. The strongest clan of Konoha would march throughout the city in a special reenactment of the defeat of the Kyuubi. One of the older kids had even said there was a princess involved. But Naruto didn't believe it. Everyone knew Konoha didn't have kings, so there couldn't be any princesses either. Whatever the truth, Naruto couldn't wait to find out for himself. With that thought, he quickly finished the last of his food. Gigi was always going on about not littering, so Naruto gathered his wrappers and stuffed them in his pockets. Hopefully, this time he'd remember to throw them away. Naruto looked around at the quiet district. He wasn't sure where he was in the village. While he had made sure to not go in the direction of the Uchiha compound, those guys were really mean. He wasn't entirely sure he was safe and out of hot water, whatever that meant anyway. Looking around again, he could only hope that while he wasn't quite sure where he was, he would at least be able to see the parade in relative peace from here. Finally, Naruto spotted a pretty tall tree and walked towards it. While it wasn't his first choice for parade watching spots, it would have to work. He'd really wanted to watch from the Hokage mountain, but the Anbu guarding the entrance wouldn't let him up. Something about no one allowed because Gigi was giving his big boring speech there. Okay, so Inu-san hadn't said boring, but he'd said speech, and all speeches were boring, everyone knew that. He felt pretty certain about that given the fact that he'd fallen asleep to enough of them, especially Gigi's speeches. All of that together meant this fine tree was going to have to be the best spot now. It was pretty nice. Naruto didn't have to worry about the villagers getting too drunk out here. Besides, the quieter districts were always safest during festivals. Well, they were in other festivals, and as long as he wasn't near the Uchiha district, he'd be fine. Naruto still thought they were overly sensitive about their underwear. Anyway, this could be his spot. He could see the fireworks from here, and surely the parade would come around here. Those were the best parts of this festival. Not the cool games, and free toys, or the shadow puppets among the many street theaters. All of those were for babies, and Naruto was not a baby. Besides, he was too cool for all of those things anyway. Yeah, the greatest shinobi of Konoha only liked the fireworks. So, that way even if the parade didn't come this way, Naruto wouldn't be disappointed because great future shinobis like himself only really cared about the fireworks. Next year he could figure out the parade path, so they could have the pleasure of the greatest shinobi to ever be born. For the parade, of course. As Naruto settled down into the tall tree, he was startled when the large wooden doors to the gate across from him opened up. Curiously, Naruto hopped down to get a better look. Had a whole clan forgotten to go to the festival? He'd figure all the people would be down in the village waiting for the parade. Naruto looked to the right and left. He wasn't even sure how far the walls went. Wow, Naruto could see through the doors to a large compound beyond. It looked like a mini village within the village. But it wasn't the mini village that stole his attention. The parade. Naruto jumped up and down happily as he watched the parade form right before his eyes. He bet no one got to see this. This large group of people, no Hyuga, began marching straight at him. They could be nothing other than the parade. And at the head of the parade was the most beautiful girl he'd ever seen. Standing taller than the trees, she was like the moonlight alone in her glory with her long hair flowing in the wind. For a moment, Naruto thought she saw him, but then he was pulled back and out of the way of the incoming parade. Kid, shouldn't you be down in the village square? Naruto looked up at the Hyuga policeman as he set him back down by Naruto's big tree. Hyuga-san, who's that? He asked, not caring about anything else. The first one out of the compound and the last one to the village square. Yatsugi Dono is our future. Naruto didn't know what Yatsugi meant, but he did know that Dono was for lords and ladies. He couldn't believe it. Daiji was right. There was a princess in the parade, and she was Konoha's princess. She's the princess of Konoha, Naruto replied in awe. It was official. This was the best birthday ever. The sun's brilliant rays slowly gained dominance as it rose higher and higher in the blindingly blue sky. Its powerful light filtered through white fluffy clouds on this unseasonably warm spring morning. It was late enough that the sun glared down from its high perch in the air. The tall trees of Konoha soaking up its powerful emissions as blue birds and black birds and birds of all colors fluttered amongst leaves and shadows. Their cheerful, sweet songs taunted Naruto as he stared longingly at them from the confines of his classroom. They looked like they were having so much fun. Flying where they wanted to and singing the day way. Not stuck in a stuffy classroom trying to get through another mind-numbing lecture. The window was a doorway to another world that he desperately wished he could escape to, leaving behind the droning words of his boring sensei. What was so interesting about history anyway? How was the Second Shinobi War supposed to make him a better ninja? It wasn't as if he was going to gain anything from sensei's lecture anyway. The books they gave him were often larger than everyone else's. The print was small and the words really hard to understand. And it wasn't like he could ask questions. No, he'd tried that before and he wasn't in a rush to repeat the experience. All his curiosity had earned him was embarrassment as he'd been reduced to the butt end of a joke. He still wasn't entirely sure what was so funny that caused both his sensei and his classmates to burst out into laughter. Not that the laughter had hurt him or anything. He was going to be a great shinobi. No, not just great, he was going to be one of the best. Little things like that didn't even faze him. So what if he didn't understand everything right away? He was still going to be the most kick-ass ninja in the village. Naruto sighed as he watched the birds flutter outside his window. 4 years in the academy and she still wasn't here. He'd waited 4 years, hoping that he'd get to see her again. Up close this time so they'd have a chance to talk. Naruto was sure if they ever got that chance then they would be the best of friends. While he'd heard in passing that the Hyugas always entered the academy late, he'd secretly hoped that they were wrong. However, this year was the last one for new additions. This was it. Everyone knew you had to have at least 2 years of academy training. Maybe she's not coming. Maybe she doesn't want to be a ninja, he thought with a disappointed sigh. No, that's not right. She's the princess of Konoha. She has to be a ninja, a great kunoichi. He cheered himself up. There just wasn't a way for her not to be a ninja. Not in Konoha. I suppose a princess would have private tutors, he thought as he traced the path of a particularly vibrant red bird. Aw man, she's probably learning really cool jutsu right now and all I'm learning is stupid Konoha history, he pouted, head in hand as he continued to ignore the lecture from the front of the classroom. I'm already falling behind. Naruto leaned back in his chair as sensei continued to drone on at the front of the classroom. He wasn't entirely sure what they were supposed to be learning and frankly he didn't really care. Heck, he hadn't even bothered to remember his sensei's name, and he'd had the man for months now. It wasn't as if it mattered anyway. That man was just like the last one, and the one before that and the one before him. They were all the same, and he really didn't expect that to change anytime soon. While Naruto wasn't entirely sure, he thought they were supposed to be going over clans today. At least, he thought it was something like that. Again, he didn't really care. If he wanted to learn about clans he'd challenge Shikamaru to a game of shogi and ask him then. Or better yet punch Sasuke in the face. That one always got him going. Of course then he'd never hear the end of it. It would be, my clan this and my clan that, and of course Sakura or Ino or one of the other girls in class would feel the need to add something or another to it. Heck, he could just as easily do a prank with Kiba-kun and ask him about them. It would save Naruto the trouble with Sasuke at the very least. In the end, there was really no need to go over them in class. The Hyuga. Naruto snapped his attention back to Sensei at the front of the classroom at the sound of the familiar name. As we all have heard before, the Hyuga are one of the 3 original founders of our village. While getting the Uchiha to join the village had been a relatively easy task for Senju Hashirama, who later became the Shodai Hokage. The legendary blood feud between the Senju and the Hyuga clans, however, made the second task of getting the honorable Hyuga clan to join his alliance difficult. It is said that the Shadaime befriended Hyuga Hanza, the leader to the Hyuga clan, as a child, which greatly aided with the alliance process. What was the feud about? Kiba-kun asked Sensei. Naruto leaned forward in his seat. He was curious too. He'd always thought the Hyugas had willingly joined Konoha. Good question, Inuzuka-san. The Senju and Hyuga clans were often hired by opposing factions to counterbalance the other. You must remember, this was the time of the warring states before ninja villages existed as we know them today. So, there was great blood between the 2 clans. Sensei paused to let his information sink in. Naruto had to give him credit. Sometimes he made the lectures pretty interesting. To an average person, it seemed like an impossible task to unite the 2 clans to form the new hidden village. While not impossible for our great Shadaime, it was not an easy route. It took years of fighting, before Hanza Dono and the Shadaime could come to a truce. Still, Hanza Dono would not agree to join the Shadaime in his attempt to build a village. Only after years of treating the Hyuga with respect and fairness, was he finally able to convince them to join the Senju in forming the new hidden village. Now class, can anyone tell me the terms of the treaty? Naruto watched as Sakura shot her hand up into the air. Yes, Haruno-san, Sensei acknowledged her with a nod. The Hyuga clan were given the police force, in exchange for never having one of their clan members become the Hokage, she answered with a smug smile on her face. Naruto frowned. He had never been a big fan of her "I'm better than you because I know it all" attitude. That is correct, Haruno-san. I see at least some of you are doing your assigned readings, he continued with a pointed look in Naruto's direction. This of course garnered a rather loud round of laughter from the class. They all knew who that comment was aimed at. All right class, settle down. Now, as Haruno-san has excellently stated, the Hyuga clan was given the exclusive right to maintain and control the police force that keeps watch over our great village, in exchange for never having a Hyuga as Hokage. Sensei paused here to give the class a mischievous look. They have since grown to becoming the most prominent clan within the hidden village of the Leaf, while the Senju have become all but extinct, so I think it's safe to say they didn't get the raw end of that bargain. In fact, the Koshi is considered the 3rd highest ranking member of the village, right behind her father and the Hokage. Wait, what's a Koshi? Naruto loudly interrupted Sensei. He was too interested in anything and everything that had to do with the Princess of Konoha to care if the class continued to make fun of him. The Hyuga heir, you idiot! Sakura yelled with a sarcastic roll of her eyes. Huh, came Naruto's first response, earning a small round of chuckles from nearby classmates. It took another minute to think in circles. The 3rd highest ranking member, right behind Gigi and her dad. That could only be, you mean the Princess of Konoha. He shouted in glee. Finally, something he knew. The room was silent as everyone took a moment to stare at Naruto. You're actually kind of slow in the head, Sensei replied, breaking the silence of the room. But, I guess the Hyuga heiress could be considered that, in a very roundabout way. Dude, how do you mess that up? Kiba-kun questioned loudly. She's like the most important kid in the village. Even you should know who she is. Of course I know who she is. She the princess of Konoha. And I'm going to be her best friend when she finally gets here. Believe it, Naruto stated self-assuredly. You, the dead last, Sensei exclaimed. Whether it was from shock or disbelief, Naruto wasn't sure. After a beat, the entire room burst into a fit of laughter. Some laughed so hard that they toppled over in their seats. You'd have better luck becoming Hokage, Sasuke added in between peals of laughter, causing the class to laugh even harder. I will be her best friend, believe it. Even if I have to become the Hokage to do it. I'll never give up because that's my ninja way. Naruto declared, not at all fazed by their laughter. If he was going to succeed in his goal, he'd need to handle a heck of a lot more than their laughter. Enough of this, Uzumaki. You were dismissed from class for disruption. What? I only asked a question. It was a stupid question and completely disruptive to the learning environment. Now out so that serious students can learn. With a huff, Naruto slowly rose from his seat before walking out of the classroom. Temi, he thought as he closed the door behind him. He knew how to handle Temura even if it was a whole class worth of them. Naruto had patience for only two things: waiting for the princess of Konoha to finally join the academy so he could befriend her, and waiting for the perfect time to pull off a prank. Not even the 3-minute wait for instant ramen garnered this type of patience. Thus sitting quietly in the shadows waiting for his class to break for lunch and for Sensei to leave was a surprisingly easy feat for him to accomplish. Hiding in the shadow of one of his favorite trees, Naruto did one more spot check of his materials. Camouflage paper, ninja wire, flour, glue. He silently wished that there was another way to carry all the things he needed for a good prank. He hated being limited by the size of his small knapsack. Only partially distracted by his thoughts, Naruto's weight seemed to go by quickly. It also probably helped that he'd been kicked out just prior to the lunch break. He watched as his classmates rushed from the classroom, some faster than others, and counted each one as they left. With every student safely outside, he stood still. It was a rookie mistake to forget about master pranking rule number 24 and not wait for every last person to vacate the area. That most definitely included Sensei, so Naruto waited because he was well past the rookie stage. Finally his patience paid off as he tracked his sensei's exit. Hopping down from his perch, Naruto stealthily made his way to the empty classroom, only pausing once to look back at the playing children. While he'd rather be right beside them playing outside, some things were just too important. So, Naruto turned his attention back to the task at hand. Sneaking into the empty classroom was too easy. He was actually a little disappointed. He'd had a harder time pranking the Uchiha compound. Now, they couldn't take a joke. Once safely inside, Naruto gave the room a quick once-over from the shadows. No one left and no one near the windows. He smiled at his good fortune as he silently made his way to Sensei's desk. Running his hand over the desk and chair, Naruto searched for the familiar alarm. Oh, there it is, he thought with glee as he quickly disabled the trip alarm his senseis had started putting on their desks years ago. Sensei really should have used a harder one. Naruto had figured a way around this one at the start of the new class year. Alarm disabled, Naruto got to work on his desk trap first. A simple wire lever trap attached to the desk drawer, subtle enough to go unnoticed in most situations. It was bound to be activated based on its location, but as master pranking rule number 14 stated, never leave anything to chance. He needed to make sure his trap would be triggered. Spotting Sensei's lecture notes on the top of the desk, Naruto quickly moved them inside the desk drawer. Now Sensei will have to open his desk to start class, he thought as he moved on to rig the rest of the trap. Wire trigger in place, Naruto set up his ceiling trap using his custom-dyed camouflage paper, taking the extra time to make sure it would be impossible to detect. The 30 long minutes it took to set up was well worth the satisfaction of having it look just the way he liked it. Soon the sound of returning students filled the air, signaling the limited time he had left. Hastily, he added a glue rig to the seat of Sensei's chair. It was a classic, but more importantly it was blaringly obvious that it was attached to Sensei's desk drawer. With any luck, it would distract Sensei from the real trap. Snickering quietly to himself, Naruto hopped out the window to get a good seat to watch the show. Perched at the top of the tree directly across from the window to his classroom, Naruto leant forward to watch his prank in action. As the unsuspecting class filled the room, Naruto kept his eyes on Sensei. As expected, the man that had been teaching him for the last few months spotted the obvious seat trap. With the glue safely removed from his chair, Naruto watched a smug smile cross his face. Still completely unaware of the real trap that awaited him and the entire class, Naruto smiled. This was going to be good. Naruto watched with bated breath as Sensei started looking for his lecture notes. "Sorry Sensei, you're not going to find them there," Naruto thought as he watched the man search the top of his desk. "Now, look inside of your desk," he added silently. As if responding to a direct command, Sensei reached for his desk drawer and opened it. For a split second nothing happened, and then, boom! All hell broke loose as flour poured down onto everyone and everything. Breaking out into laughter, Naruto enjoyed the fruits of his labor. Flour rained down on the entire classroom like the winter snow he'd seen in theaters. Naruto easily ignored the fact that he'd snuck into said movie to see it as he continued to watch the calamity. Everyone was covered in flour. Sasuke looked like a grumpy ghost, the flour making his outfit finally match his hauntingly pale skin as he glared out across the room, clearly unsure of who to place his heated glare on without Naruto in the area. Sakura's unfortunate coloring made her look like a fluff pastry, all shades of pink and white. In desperation, she tried to shake the white powder from her hair, but it only ended up weaving deeper into the confines of the pink strands. Some of the other girls outright screamed about the flour getting in their beautifully done hair. Hiba-kun ended up in an uncontrollable sneezing fit while Choji-san had given up getting the flour out of his bag of chips and simply opened a new one. Only Shikamaru-san and Shino-san failed to react to his cleverly designed prank. He'd have to think of something even more spectacular to get a reaction out of those two. Challenge accepted. And best of all was the interesting shade of red that his sensei was turning. It was a real shame all he had room to bring was flour. This prank would have been 10 times better if he'd had feathers and honey too. Conjuring up an image of a feather-covered sensei, Naruto burst out in another round of laughter. He would have to find some way to make that happen. Uzumaki Naruto! Sensei screamed at the top of his lungs, jarring Naruto from his laughing fit. Oops, he gulped. He'd made a rookie mistake. He'd completely forgotten about master pranking rule number 21. He'd stayed too long. Turning on his heels, Naruto bolted from his perch. While he had a head start, he wasn't about to take that for granted. Sensei wouldn't be that far behind, and he wasn't that fast. Making his way past building after building, Naruto ran his favorite getaway path. With a right, then a left, followed by another right, and a left, he made his way to downtown Konoha. Dodging civilians and street vendors alike, he found himself in the busiest part of the city, the perfect place for losing arrogant senseis. "Hey, watch it!" someone hollered as he ran past. Ducking into another empty alleyway, Naruto couldn't help the bubble of laughter that escaped his lips. That prank was just too good, and now there was no way Sensei would catch up with him. Not with the size of the crowd he'd just woven his way through. Entering the next street over, Naruto slowed his pace down to a walk, blending into the hectic crowd surrounding him. All was right in the world that was until a sudden tug at the back of his shirt pulled him from his meandering thoughts, lifting him into the air and right into the gaze of two sets of pale eyes. Hyuga-san. So, nice to see you, Naruto greeted, nervously looking around as they gently set him down without letting go of his shirt. They'd only made that mistake once. Man, how he hated how quickly they learned. Uzumaki-san, shouldn't you be in class? Questioned the Hyuga that still had him in a vice grip. Well, you see, I was just on my way, so if you could, he began, pointing to the left as he edged towards the right. Visual misdirection was always a good tool to have in your mastery of escape arsenal. Catching sight of his sensei frantically searching for him out of the corner of his eye, Naruto silently cursed. He'd been spotted. This would have never happened if he'd gotten stopped by anyone other than the Hyuga police. Shimada. They were just too easy to spot in a crowd. Hyuga-san and his partnered Hyuga looked at him critically, before his grip tightened on his shirt. Perhaps we should escort you back there then, Uzumaki-san, so you can escape any troubling situations with your sensei, the other Hyuga announced. Naruto looked hastily at his sensei making his way closer to him. He needed to lose the Hyuga-sans and fast. No, that's all right, I can make, Uzumaki, sensei shouted, interrupting him in the process of making his escape. Luckily for him, the interruption distracted the Hyuga-san, gripping his shirt enough for him to wiggle himself out of his grasp, allowing him to slip away and disappear into an adjacent alleyway. Naruto could just make out the rest of Sensei's words as he ran full blast in the opposite direction. Stop him. Running. Naruto frantically searched his brain for a way to lose his Hyuga tails. If he remembered correctly, he had the perfect hiding place nearby, but he had to get to it first. 10 more seconds and he was in the clear. It was at the right angle, the perfect angle that no matter what direction the Hyugas came at him, they'd still miss him. 5, 4, 3. Naruto was staring freedom in the eyes. 2. Bang. Naruto fell backwards after running right into another body. What the? Looking up, Naruto came face to face with Weasel-san's mask. Going somewhere, Uzumaki-san? Weasel-san's soft voice asked. Not anymore, he wasn't. I'm telling you, Weasel-san. This isn't necessary, Naruto complained as he struggled in Weasel-san's grasp. I'd have gone quietly, he shouted as he was gently set down on the floor. That is highly unlikely, Uzumaki-san, Weasel-san teased softly. I have yet to see you do anything quietly. Naruto looked around only to see the familiar sight of the secretary giving him the stink eye. He stuck his tongue out at her as a reply. I still don't see why you had to take me to see Gigi, Naruto whined as he returned his attention to Weasel-san. We could have kept this between us. Just you and me, Weasel-san. Honest, I'd have done whatever you'd asked. If that's true, Uzumaki-san, then please wait quietly for Hokage-sama to see you. Naruto's face turned into a large pout at the request. That was the best he was likely to get from Weasel-san. Too bad it hadn't been Inu-san. Sometimes he'd let his actions slide. Wait here quietly, please, Uzumaki-san. I would not like to have to retrieve you again. Hi. Naruto relented as he plopped down on one of the chairs outside Gigi's office. There was no point in running now, he was good and caught. In a swirl of leaves, Weasel-san disappeared, leaving Naruto to practice his patience on something far less exciting than pranks, waiting on Gigi to lecture him. He failed at it, epically, tapping his foot noisily for what felt like hours before he gave up and went to bother Gigi's secretary. Hey boss-san, when's Gigi going to be out? It's been like hours. Maybe I should go, since Gigi's so busy. Uzumaki-san, you've been here for 2 minutes. The Hokage-sama will be out after he's done with his meeting. Go back over there and wait, and stop that insufferable tapping. Naruto huffed in frustration before plopping back down into his seat. He had half a mind to start tapping again, at least that would give him something to do while he sat here aging, but he didn't bother. The secretary may not have liked him, but at least she tolerated his presence. There was no reason to change that, not even for a small reprieve from this unending boredom. He sighed as he looked at the wall across from him. He couldn't even look out the window from this level. This was going to take forever. A lifetime later, the Hokage's office door opened and a Hyuga-san stepped out. "Ah, one more thing, Hiyashi-san." The Hyuga nodded in response before turning to his right. "Reishi, wait for me here," he ordered quietly to the unseen person behind him. "Hi, Otu-sama," a female voice replied. Her voice was light, yet firm, but Naruto noticed neither quality as he was too disappointed at the prospect of his wait being extended. Momentarily downtrodden when he realized he'd be sitting out here in the lobby longer, Naruto's melancholy did a complete 180 when he finally noticed exactly who had walked out behind the stuffy-looking Hyuga-san. It was her, the princess of Konoha. She walked out of the door, then stood ramrod straight just to the right of it. Naruto jumped out of his seat in excitement. "Hiya, where've you been? I thought you'd be at the academy by now. Is that why you're here? To get into the academy? That's so cool. I'll show you around all the cool places once you're there. You can sit next to me and. Naruto paused to take a breath and froze at the intensity of the princess's gaze. He'd never had someone's full attention like this. More than that was the way she was looking at him as if expecting something from him. It left him feeling like he'd forgotten something or he was screwing this up. What did Gigi always say? Something about being polite and slowing down. Oh, sorry, I mean, sometimes I ask too many questions at once. It's so cool you're here though. Naruto responded sheepishly as he rubbed the back of his head nervously. Forgive me, but you seem to have me at somewhat of a disadvantage, she spoke calmly while leveling her cool lavender stare at him. It was unnerving, but in a way he'd never experienced. Not angry, or uninterested, or even too superior to be bothered with him. Whatever it was, it left him with a good kind of anxious feeling. "Huh?" he inquired, still unnerved by her heavy gaze and unable to form a more coherent thought. What was she even talking about with disadvantages? "You seem to know who I am." However, she began to elaborate, but by then Naruto had found his voice once more. "Yup, you're the princess of Konoha, Hyuga Haim," he interrupted jovially. "I do not believe I have ever been addressed in that manner," she replied, completely unaffected by his interruption. "Oh, really? That seems really disrespectful. I mean, there's no other way to address a princess. That's it. I'll have to make sure everyone knows the right way." "Believe it," Naruto declared, confused on why anyone would address a princess disrespectfully. Even he knew how to behave in the presence of a princess. It was just common sense. "While that is very kind of you to do, should I not know your name before you do this on my behalf?" she inquired politely, making Naruto feel 10 different conflicting emotions at once. On the one hand he was elated that she seemed to approve of his new life goal, while on the other he was a little embarrassed that he'd forgotten to introduce himself. Gigi had told him over and over again to introduce himself before he just started talking. Oh, I'm Uzumaki Naruto, future greatest shinobi to ever live. Believe it," he declared loudly before he remembered just who he was talking to. He winced in preparation. This was normally the part where people started to ridicule him. "Oh, I was unaware that there were Uzumakis still residing within the village," she replied, and while there was a slight lift to her left eyebrow there was no other change to her speech pattern or mood. The princess wasn't angry with him. If anything, she was intrigued. Naruto was so stunned that not only was she still talking to him, but she wasn't angry with him at all that he almost missed her next words. "It is a pleasure to meet you, Uzumaki-san." Hyuga Haim bowed her head slightly in greeting. Nearly falling over himself in his attempt to emulate her, Naruto bowed his head low. Awkwardly bent at the waist, he felt kind of weird. He'd never been bowed to before. He'd also never felt the need to bow to anyone before this either. "It's a pleasure to meet you too," he called from his bent position, not entirely sure when he was supposed to rise. "Uzumaki-san, you may rise now," the princess replied softly, and Naruto could have sworn he saw the beginnings of a smile in her eyes as he hastily did as instructed. "Oh, yeah, thanks," he responded sheepishly. "So, are you joining the academy now? Is that why you're here?" "The Ninja Academy?" Naruto nodded vigorously. "No, I will be continuing my education privately until the Genin exams." Naruto's face fell at her revelation. "Oh," he added quietly. He had really been looking forward to having her in class with him. "Perhaps we shall be placed on the same team," she continued, and Naruto perked right back up at that, smiling like crazy. While his previous hope had been dashed, he had something new to look forward to. Something even better than just having class with Hyuga Haim. "Hi, that would be awesome. You'll want me on your team too, 'cause I'm the best," Naruto shouted in excitement while flexing his arms. He had to make sure she knew he wasn't lying about being the best. "I look forward to it then, Uzumaki-san," she replied just as calmly as she had before, but when Naruto looked up he knew he saw the remnants of a smile in her pale lavender eyes. Her face may have been just as neutral as before, but he knew he had made her laugh. Well, maybe not out loud, but that could change. "I'm going to make you laugh one day, believe it," he declared quietly to himself as he smiled brightly at her, completely undeterred by her stoic presence. He knew what was really beneath that cool exterior. The door opened, then capturing Hyuga Haim's complete attention as the older Hyuga-san walked out with Gigi in tow. Naruto was confused. Did he do something wrong? "Think about it, Hiyashi-san. I think it would be beneficial to both the village and the Hyuga's future. I have heard what you have to say, Hokage-sama, but my answer is final." "Good day," the older Hyuga answered coldly as he continued down the corridor without pause. "Reishi, please move quickly, we have much to do today." Hyuga Haim did not reply. She simply fell into place to the right and slightly behind who Naruto could only guess was her father. Naruto watched them go sadly. Man, he seemed kind of mean, and not just because he completely stole Hyuga Haim's attention away from him. Naruto hoped his new best friend would be alright. Naruto stared in that direction for a little while more as Gigi took a long drag from his pipe, lost in thought. "Come, Naruto-kun. I believe we have something to talk about, again." With a shrug, Naruto rubbed the back of his head as he followed Gigi into his office. Sarutobi Hiruzen was far too old for this job. He knew it. He'd known it for some time now. It had been the original reason he'd stepped down more than 10 years ago. Had everything gone as planned, had the Kyuubi not been released, then he'd still be enjoying his retirement, happily playing grandfather to little Konohamaru-chan and possibly young Naruto-kun as well. But the fates had not been kind, and here he sat behind the very desk he'd once thought he'd escaped. He really was too old for the job. And after conversations like the one he'd just endured moments ago, he was reminded of that very fact. Looking at the youth of Konoha, Hiruzen worried about the future of the village. Each new generation seemed to lose more and more of the burning will of fire. Each year a little bit more of the will of fire was forgotten. With Naruto-kun following closely on his heels, he could only hope that the son of the Yondaime could change that. Hiruzen looked out at the Hokage mountain. "Minato, what do you think of your son?" This was not the first time Naruto-kun's actions had garnered his attention. His attention-seeking pranks, while funny, were getting a little out of hand. The Hyuga were beginning to complain about how hard it was becoming to catch the young prankster. A part of Hiruzen was proud. It was not an easy feat to hide from the Hyuga's all-seeing Byakugan. Still, Naruto-kun managed it. Hiruzen couldn't even make catching Naruto-kun a D-ranked mission anymore. In truth, he'd long since given up trying to call it a D-ranked mission as genin teams had trouble catching the boy when he was only 6. Now, at the rambunctious age of 10, even Chunin were having problems tracking the young boy. Of course, he could have just picked him up from the academy the next day, however that would have given him a false sense of success. Hiruzen had already promised Naruto-kun that if he didn't get caught the day of, then he'd not see any punishment. Nevertheless, he couldn't let the boy think that outrunning Chunin would be good enough in the long run. It would be doing a disservice to Naruto-kun's shinobi training. As it was, catching Naruto-kun was good training for the village as a whole, so he saw no real reason to come down on Naruto-kun hard enough to make him stop his antics altogether. Still, he couldn't ignore the Hyuga. More importantly, he didn't want to have to rely on his Anbu to catch the boy. They had better things to do than run after Naruto-kun. Whether he'd liked or not, he was going to have to curb Naruto-kun's pranks. Looking over at the rambunctious lad, Hiruzen modified his assessment. There was very little chance he'd actually manage to get Naruto-kun to curb his pranks, but at the very least he could find a way to curb the frequency of them. Hiruzen sighed heavily as he took another long drag on his pipe. How to approach this conversation? The Sandai Hokage turned around to face the music. He could no longer put off this conversation, no matter how many times he'd given it to Naruto-kun. Maybe this time it would stick. Before the Hokage could begin his lecture, Naruto-kun interrupted him. I know, Gigi. No more pranking. Be good, study hard and stop fooling around in class and out of it. Time to be a serious shinobi. I got it, Gigi. Now on to the cool stuff. Hiruzen glanced over at Naruto-kun, a raised eyebrow denoting his skepticism before moving on to the subject that had garnered his attention. Cool stuff? He inquired as he took another deep inhale from his pipe. Yeah. Naruto-kun nodded his head vigorously. There's an Uzumaki clan. Are there any more left in the village? Where are they from? Do you know any personally? When can I meet them? He fired off in rapid succession. Typical Naruto-kun antics. The Uzumaki clan. Hiruzen sat down as he considered the question. They were a very knowledgeable and powerful clan, but I thought they went over them during the clan's lecture in the academy. The clan's lecture. Naruto-kun put his hand under his chin in thought. Yeah, I think that was the one for today, but the Uzumaki clan wasn't even mentioned. I've not even heard of them before. Do I have family? Naruto-kun looked up hopefully. Hiruzen hated to disappoint him, but maybe this could be a good teaching moment. Are you sure you weren't daydreaming, Naruto-kun? The Sandame replied playfully as he took another smoke of his pipe. Nah, Gigi. I'd have heard if Sensei had mentioned an Uzumaki clan. Do you know any more? Are they real? Hiruzen laughed good naturally at Naruto-kun's eagerness. Why, yes Naruto-kun, the Uzumakis are a very real clan. Unfortunately, there are no more Uzumakis, besides yourself, left in the village. What happened? Are the Uzumakis not from Konoha? Naruto-kun asked eagerly. Well, that's a long story, Naruto-kun. A very complex tale. Hiruzen leaned back in his chair readying himself as he took another pull from his pipe. He'd be honored to be the one to tell Naruto-kun of his history, well, at least part of his family legacy. However, no sooner had the Sandame found the right words to begin, than he felt the presence of one of his Anbu. Hiruzen sighed heavily. This was going to have to wait. I'd love to tell you all about them, Naruto-kun, but it looks like I'm needed elsewhere. Naruto-kun's face fell. Oh, Hiruzen couldn't look at the Yondaime's legacy without doing something. If he couldn't tell Naruto-kun now, and the academy had left it out of his education, then Hiruzen would have to improvise. But, I do know there is an extensive section in the library on the Uzumaki clan. They were very important to the makings of the village. I'm sure you will find all you want to know about them there. Naruto-kun perked back up again. Alright, thanks Gigi. Bye. He nearly ran out of his office in his hurry to unearth the secrets of his clan. Oh, and Naruto-kun, Hiruzen stopped him before he'd gotten too far. Do try to stay out of trouble this time. Sure thing Gigi, he replied with a large smile on his face. Hiruzen looked after Naruto-kun as he left. Minato and Kushina would be so proud. Naruto approached the Konoha library with trepidation. The old woman at the front, guarding all the books and scroll and other such materials, had never once let him pass the entry hall, but that didn't mean he wasn't going to try. This time would be different. He was on official Hokage business, at least, that was what he was going to tell her. Even if that old bat glared down at him and shooed him away, he was going to give this his best shot. He finally had a compelling reason to use the building. He was going to get in there today one way or another. His first plan was to attempt this the easy way, just like Master Pranking Rule number 9 stated. There was no point in thinking up some complicated plan if he hadn't tried this the easy way first. So, he was going to walk into that building, turn to the old hag and ask. Now some might think he was crazy. Why attempt something that was almost guaranteed to fail? If there was one lesson that he'd learned in his 10 years, then it was that nothing was guaranteed unless you didn't bother to ask. It reminded him of the time the kind ramen stand owner had given him a free bowl of ramen because it had been his 13th visit. Naruto was no fool. He'd been aware that the kind old man had made up that little reward. But he hadn't scoffed at the gift. How could he? It had been days since his last decent meal, as he'd run out of the small amount of money that Gigi had managed to get for him. That had been the time before he'd learned to properly manage the small sum, buy only what he absolutely needed and only from the stores that didn't charge too much. But the lesson he'd learned was clear. You didn't know the answer until you asked the question, so like any other time, he was going to ask. Walking into the large building with as much confidence as he could muster, Naruto attempted to walk right past the old woman guarding the entrance. And just where do you think you're going? The old bat crowed at him. A crooked, wrinkled finger pointed in his direction, stopping him in his tracks. I'm on official Hokage business, you old hag, Naruto replied smugly. There was no way she could turn him away this time. Where's your mission statement then, you little brat? She asked while narrowing her gaze. Well shit, he didn't have one of those. I left it in my other pants, he tried. She was old, maybe she wouldn't notice the little white lie. Liar. Now out. Get out of my library, you little street urchin, before I throw you out. She yelled at him. Despite her advanced age, he was inclined to believe that she could actually throw him out. Either way, he wasn't about to risk it. This was why he always had a plan B. Walking back out of the library, Naruto stuffed his hands in his pockets as he grumbled to himself. At least the old bat hadn't called him dirty like last time. He took real offense to that, considering he always made sure he washed at least twice a week. That was more than enough in his book. Head still down, Naruto made his way to an empty alleyway. He had to make sure that he looked like he'd truly given up, or it might ruin his next attempt. He was good, but he wasn't that good, at least, not yet. He didn't want her to look too closely. While he royally at the academy Bunshin technique, his henge was second to none in the academy. He'd taken the basics of the jutsu and made it his own, creating one very special jutsu. While he still had a few kinks to work out of his special sexy no jutsu, the skills he'd picked up while improving it had allowed him to gain exceptional skill at the basic henge. As it was a skill that he didn't mind exploiting for his own personal gain, he was more than happy to put it to use here. If it worked on grumpy store owners, it should work on the grumpy old woman. Using his henge, Naruto transformed into a civilian-born student from his class. Brown hair, brown eyes and of average build, he was as plain as they came. This would work perfectly. Aptly disguised, Naruto tried again. With the confidence that came with previous cases of success, he walked right into the building and straight past the evil woman claiming to be a librarian. He cheered internally when she didn't so much as give him the stink eye as he walked past. He was now that much closer to finding out about his clan. The hard part was officially over. Grinning impishly, Naruto set to work on finding information on his clan. Checking bookcase after bookcase, he was determined. The information would be here somewhere and he wasn't going to stop until he found it. Believe it. Minutes ticked by as he continued his search. Checking section after section, quickly skipping things he didn't care about. He sighed at how long it was taking. Finally, after what felt like a lifetime of searching, he stumbled upon the clan section. Skimming the section, Naruto took note of some of the titles: Aburame, Akamichi, Fuma, Hitaki, and Hyuga. Here he took a moment to pause. He did want to know more about the clan of his best friend. Still, maybe some other time, he wasn't really here for that. Continuing on, he skipped over Inuzuka, Keigetsu, Kamizuru, Kohaku, and Kurama. He briefly glances over Nara, Sarutobi, Senju, Shimura, and Tsushigumo, taking note that Jiji belonged to a clan as well. That was pretty cool. Finally, as his hand glossed over Uchiha, he saw it. The Uzumaki clan. Theirs was just waiting for him to investigate. No way, he gasped, surprised to actually see his name across the titles of books. It was one thing to hear Jiji talk about it and another to actually see it with his own eyes. A small part of him hadn't really believed the old man when he'd said it. It was refreshing to see that Jiji hadn't lied to him just to make him feel better. And the best part was the fact that it wasn't just one book like some of the other sections he'd pasted. No, there were just as many volumes on the Uzumakis as there were about the Uchiha. In fact, this first one even looked bigger than most of the Uchiha volumes. Pulling the book from the shelf, Naruto skimmed the pages. He wasn't naive enough to think he'd make it through the whole volume now. He knew the limits to his attention span. Instead, he skimmed the pages for the good stuff. He wanted to know what Uzumakis were good at. After flipping through page after page, his eyes finally land on the one word he was looking for: specialist. He read on. The Uzumakis were known for long life, super cool, high chakra, a total score, and fuinjutsu. Naruto's eyes stopped at the word fuinjutsu. Fuinjutsu. What the heck is fuinjutsu? Naruto slowly soaked in every word from the first subsection of the chapter in his book. Though he was unfamiliar with most of the kanji housed within the useful tome, he hadn't let that stop him. He'd even gone out of his way to pick up a dictionary from a completely different section of the library just to help. Sitting back down in his aisle, he let his eyes carefully take in the information, stopping only to consult the dictionary when his eyes fell upon an unfamiliar character. It was a little weird considering he'd never bothered to even open the Ninja Academy dictionary they'd given him years ago. His philosophy had always been, if he couldn't read it, then it wasn't worth reading. However, now that he had something worth reading, he didn't mind using the extra help to understand. While it took nearly 2 hours to finish just that one small part, his most pressing question still remained unanswered. Glancing back over the section he'd just read, he confirmed it. There was nothing more about fuinjutsu. No explanations. No examples. There was just that one small portion about the importance of fuinjutsu within the Uzumaki clan, and that wasn't enough. Not nearly enough. At least not for him. Of course there was more to the chapter, more to the whole book, but flipping through the pages hadn't really helped him find out more on Fuinjutsu. With the book in his lap, Naruto continued to thumb through the pages looking for just one more mention of Fuinjutsu. He was desperate to find out more, which in and of itself was kind of weird because he'd never wanted to know about something more than he did now. There was just something about Fuinjutsu, something that reached a part inside of him that had been empty for so long. Maybe it was the connection that this book, this art of sealing, had brought him. This was honestly the closest he'd ever been to having a family, and he didn't want to lose that link. Or maybe it was because this, Fuinjutsu, was something he would finally be good at. This wouldn't be like Bunshin or Kawarimi no Jutsu. He wouldn't blotch it up. Fuinjutsu was an Uzumaki specialty, and he was an Uzumaki. The only one left in the village. He had to be good at it. But there were just so many big words in the book, and so many pages to search. It was just too hard for Naruto to keep track of everything. Moreover, he'd already spent too much time in the library. It was now far later than he'd thought he'd be here and his henge was beginning to waver. Even if he wanted to stay and read the entire book now he couldn't. There wouldn't be enough time for him to sit here uninterrupted so he could read a chapter, let alone the entire book. And Naruto wasn't naive enough to believe he had the patience to sit here and just skim the whole text. He knew his limits, and he was rapidly approaching them. That only left him with one option. Casing out his small section of the library, Naruto didn't see anyone else around him. No one is going to miss a book or two on the Uzumaki clan, he thought as his grip tightened around the tome in his hand. Hadn't Gigi just told him that he was the last of the clan here in Konoha? Besides, this wasn't really stealing. He'd bring it back, honestly. This would be more like borrowing. It would only be for a little while, and he didn't think anyone else would want the book in the meantime. Plus, Naruto was pretty sure that people normally could borrow books from a library even if he'd never done it. So he wasn't really breaking any rules. With his pep talk completed and his actions fully justified, Naruto got down to business. Operation Borrow Uzumaki Clan Library book was now underway. First things first, he needed a way to sneak the book out of the library. Causally walking to the nearest restroom, book firmly in hand, Naruto made his way to the stall in the back. It would be far enough away from the door that he wasn't likely to get caught. Caution was of course the #1 tool in his mastery of escape arsenal. While he wasn't about to execute the greatest prank, and subsequent escape, the village had ever seen up to this point, he figured the same rules would apply. Sneak in, set up, get out, and most importantly don't get caught. With that thought in mind he went to work. Glancing down at the large tome in his hands, it didn't take him long to realize that the thick volume wasn't going to fit in his pants. Unfortunately, he hadn't brought a jacket with him, so there was no way he'd be able to hide it in his clothes. Although now that he thought about it, the book was so large that it probably wouldn't have fit under a jacket anyway, so that wasn't really a big loss. So, carrying it on his person was out of the picture. Guess it's time for Plan D, he thought as he quietly exited the stall, eyes quickly glancing around the bathroom to ensure that no one else had somehow snuck in while he'd been contemplating shoving a book down his pants. Naruto was satisfied to see he was still alone in the small room. Taking a more detailed look at the space, he spotted an out-of-the-way window on the far wall. Quickly sticking his head out the opening, he mentally cheered. There just so happened to be a few thick bushes near his window. However, another quick glance wiped the smile from his face. It didn't look like he was close enough for this to work, at least not for what he had in mind. Leaving the bathroom, Naruto causally cased the library for a window that could actually serve his purpose. The search was long and hard, slowed by the fact that he still needed to keep a low profile. There were several times when he'd thought the old bat was onto him. Her beady little eyes narrowed on him in a tight frown as he searched. He'd had to stop in a few random sections just to throw her off his trail. Luckily he'd had that dictionary to put away so he didn't have to stand in the middle of an aisle staring at nothing. After all, he had to make her think he was still actively looking for and looking at books so she didn't try to kick him out before he was done. To make matters worse, he'd needed to reapply his henge a couple of times as well. The longer he held it up, the harder it was to keep it in place. And even when he'd had it up, it just wasn't staying the way it was supposed to. Morphing in strange ways that was surely to give away his use of the henge even to a civilian. Naruto made a mental note to work on that. The henge was his best skill. He really needed to be able to use it all day if he had to. Well, practice did make perfect. He was just going to have to use it more often. I wonder what else I can do with this bad boy, he pondered as he continued his search. He was getting really good ideas already. Finally, just when he'd begun to lose hope, he'd stumbled upon the perfect set of windows. The last set near the front of the library would work just fine for what he had in mind. The bushes were right in front of the window. It was impossible to look out it, which meant no one would be able to look in either. It was exactly what he needed for Operation Borrow Uzumaki Clan Library book. As was typical for his luck today, that old hag had her desk right in front of the window he needed to use. He gave the old crow a quick look. Her hawk-like eyes were zeroed in on him, brows furrowed in suspicion. Shimada, this wasn't going to be easy. This was going to take all of his skill to pull off successfully. Naruto casually set his book down on the table nearest the window. He was going to need both of his hands free if this was going to work. Task completed, Naruto headed back through the library. He needed to be just far enough away so the old bat couldn't see him at the window and yet close enough for her weak hearing to actually hear the little disturbance he was about to create. So, he decided to take it at an angle that way he wouldn't be too far away and yet the window would be firmly out of her line of sight. Glancing around the section he found himself in, Naruto nodded at his good fortune. The coast was clear. Naruto fished out a spool of ninja wire from his pocket. Despite having used a considerable amount of ninja wire on his prank today, he still had more than enough to complete his current task. He'd learned early on not to leave home without more than enough for whatever he planned for the day. After all, he'd had to keep master pranking rule number 2 in mind. Always be prepared was a rule that had saved his skin on more than one occasion. There was no reason to start ignoring it now. Naruto set to work. As it was, time springs were fairly easy to make. Naruto had been doing them for years now, however he was also aware that with confidence often came the inevitable slip-ups. He couldn't afford to make mistakes right now, not when there was so much on the line. So Naruto was careful while he set the time spring trap. He treated it like this was the first time, moving slowly and paying meticulous detail to every step. He had to get this just right. Too much power and the nearby books might get shredded into little pieces of paper. He may not have liked the old hag, but this was her library. There was no reason to destroy it if he didn't have to. Even so, if he made the trap with too little power, then the falling books wouldn't make enough noise to draw the old crow's attention. A delicate trap like this was not for rookies, so it was a really good thing he was no rookie. Trap set, Naruto slowly made his way back to the front section of the library, grabbing a random book from a nearby shelf. He had 2 minutes to lose the old bat's suspicion before his trap went off. This was perhaps the most important part of his plan, and he wasn't about to waste a second of that time. Sitting down next to his book, he cracked open the random one. He needed her to focus on how innocent he looked now so she didn't remember that he'd been in the section that was about to explode. He needed her ancient brain to forget he'd ever acted suspicious for this to work. Slowly flipping through the pages, Naruto mentally counted seconds. 80 seconds. He looked up. The old woman had finally stopped staring at him. 97 seconds. He flipped another page and causally glanced to the right. The coast was still clear. No one was paying him any attention in that direction. 113 seconds. He shifted his head as he continued to fake read the book in front of him, looking at the other page. His eyes quickly glancing up to the left, he mentally cheered when he realized there wasn't a soul in that direction. 120 seconds. Right on time, a loud bang could be heard as his trap triggered. Knowing the drill, Naruto looked up in surprise, head turned in the direction of the noise while he secretly kept track of the old hag's location. He just barely managed to suppress the smile attempting to spread across his face as he watched her rise from her seat. She was slow to move, but eventually she made it to the disturbance, not once looking in his direction. Discreetly sliding out of his chair, Naruto grabbed his book before backing into the window directly behind him, opening it in the process. Not willing to waste any more time, he chucked the book out the crack and slipped back into his seat, grabbing the random book he'd been using as a decoy. He wouldn't be able to leave until the old woman was safely back in her seat, glaring daggers at overly loud patrons. If his calculations were correct, he'd be sitting here for another 10 minutes tops. He could wait that long. Kicking the door shut behind him, Naruto made his way to his kitchen table. He hadn't bothered to check his basic traps, too eager to start reading his newly acquired book to worry about possible break-ins. It wasn't as if anyone had tried to get into his place in the last few years. Truthfully, he probably could have taken down the traps altogether, but old habits die hard. And as Master Pranking Rule number 22 stated, never get too comfortable, because you can never be absolutely sure they've really stopped chasing you. Setting the heavy tome on top of the worn surface of his kitchen table, Naruto turned to his ancient stove. The gas line was a little bit finicky, so he had to be extra careful while turning the old thing on. Stove lit, he grabbed his trusty kettle. The squat little orange appliance had been with him since Gigi had gotten him this little slice of heaven. His own haven away from the looks and whispers, he treasured the little space he could call his own. It didn't matter if there were a few cracks in the wallpaper or if the hot water only worked half the time. This place was his and he loved it. Filling his kettle with water, he plopped it down on the stove, hopping onto the counter so that he could reach his stash of ramen. He couldn't wait until his growth spurt finally kicked in so he wouldn't have to climb his own appliances just to reach the food in his kitchen. Gigi said it wouldn't be too long now before he actually grew some. Hopefully the old man wasn't just trying to make him feel better about being the shortest in his class. Sliding back down to the floor, Naruto set his cup ramen on the counter before turning back to his kitchen table. Normally, he would have waited impatiently for the water to boil. A length of time far more agonizing than the 3-minute wait for his ramen to cook, simply because he knew he still had those dreaded 3 minutes after the water was ready. Man, did he hate that wait. If only there was some way to speed the whole process up. What he wouldn't give for a special technique that could do that. Shaking his head, Naruto turned to his book, picking it up and thumbing through the pages as he sat down in one of the 2 seats he had at the table. He guessed that luck really was on his side today, because for the first time he actually had something he wanted to do during the long wait for his food. Finally finding the spot he'd stopped at in the library, Naruto began to read. Man, life couldn't get too much better than this, he thought as he leant back in his chair, curious eyes ready to soak up every bit of information offered to him. The Uzumaki clan is a distant blood relation to the Senju clan, the key founder of our great village of Konoha. The birds were chirping, the sun was out, and Naruto had a little lift to his steps as he trudged his way to the academy. He'd stayed up far later than he would have liked, but he couldn't really complain. Not when he'd managed to make it through the whole first chapter of his new book. He'd learned so much in just a few hours. It was amazing. And for the first time in a long while he was actually looking forward to reading more of a book. He couldn't remember a time when he was this excited to read. But he was. In fact, he was so excited to learn more about his clan that he'd brought the book with him. There was bound to be some time during the day when he'd be able to read more, even if it was just his lunch break. He felt a little weird. The only thing he'd ever skipped lunch for before was to do a prank. Now he wanted to read. He wondered if that made him a bookworm like Sakura-san. Nah, he was reading about his clan, his family. And they were cool. Reading about cool things was totally acceptable. Nodding to himself, Naruto thought about all he'd learned about his clan last night. The coolest thing he could think of was Fuinjutsu. The Uzumaki clan was supposed to be amazing at it. That meant when he learned it, he'd be just as good. No, I'll be better. I'll be the best Fuinjutsu user the Uzumaki clan has ever produced. Believe it, Naruto thought as he jumped up, punching the air in his excitement. And then there was elemental chakra. He wasn't exactly sure what that was, but that sounded pretty cool too. Well, not as cool as Fuinjutsu, but totally awesome nonetheless. After all, anything with chakra in its name was bound to be awesome. He'd have to learn more about that too, but maybe after he became an awesome Fuinjutsu user. Snickering, Naruto couldn't help but remember the parts he'd read about all the clans and how they were related. As it turned out, the Uzumaki clan was a distant relative to the Senju, just like the Uchiha clan was a distant relative to the Hyuga. That meant Sasuke was a lot like him. They both came from clans that were only offshoots of more powerful lines, the first two clans to exist. It was actually kind of funny how the Uchiha acted so high and mighty when they weren't as old or as powerful as the clan they'd originated from. He would have to remember that so he could rub it in Sasuke's face. Yup, they were pretty much the same in that regard. Naruto briefly wondered about the Uzumaki traits. They were supposed to have red hair, but he'd spent hours this morning looking and he couldn't find a trace of red in his hair. He'd thought he might have seen a strand or two, but that could have easily been wishful thinking. Clearly he got his looks from his mom. She must have had blonde hair too. Naruto had already started dreaming about them again, his parents. His mom with blonde hair, he wondered if she was part of a clan too. Ino-san did have blonde hair. Nah, that was just too weird. Besides, it was okay that she didn't have a clan. It wasn't like everyone could belong to one after all. Naruto's dad though was an Uzumaki, which meant he had to have been a great seal master. He could just picture him now with spiky red hair. He'd have been a prankster like him too. That's what Uzumakis did. It said so in the book and everything. Naruto wondered if he ought to get armor made just like the picture he'd found in his book. It was pretty cool, but a bit old-fashioned. He wasn't sure if any of the clans still had armor like that. Maybe the Akamichi. Naruto shook his head in thought. Nah, the armor was out. It really was too outdated for him. Not to mention completely boring. Where was the color? The flair? The pizzazz? Oh well, it seemed like color was missing from most of the clans, wardrobe as well. Just look at the Hyuga. If the Hyuga police uniforms were standard clan wear, then he wasn't sure he wanted the Uzumaki clan to follow that pattern. He guessed he'd just have to change that. The Uzumaki clan couldn't be boring. They had to be strong and cool. The perfect combination of awesome. So from now on, his clan would have to wear orange, believe it. It was the coolest color out there. Naruto had barely made it one step into the classroom before he'd felt a violent tug at the back of his shirt. Stumbling slightly, his grip on his book tightened as he tried not to drop it. Nanda, he wondered as he turned slightly. Oh, his thoughts continued as he spied the angry glare of his sensei. He didn't look too happy to see him. Well, he never looked too happy to see him, but today he looked especially pissed. Shimada, he internally cursed as he turned fully around to face the irate man. This would not end well. Ohayu, sensei, how was the rest of yesterday's class? I hope nothing too exciting happened. He laughed lightly, trying not to tick off the man in front of him too badly, but unable to stop the image of a flower-covered sensei from entering his head. We had a bit of a disruption after you left, Uzumaki. A no-good prankster attacked the class. The older man nearly spat the word prankster at him. It was fairly clear who he thought was responsible for that incident. Well, that's really too bad, sensei, he replied, attempting to channel as much innocence as he possibly could. If the look on sensei's face was any indicator, then he didn't think he was doing a good enough job. He'd have to work on that. Mastered facial expressions were an important tool in his master pranking and escape arsenal after all. I might not be able to prove it, but I know it was you, Uzumaki, sensei accused, the vein on his forehead bulging from what Naruto could only guess was his barely restrained anger. Gomen sensei, but I have no idea what you're talking about, Naruto responded quickly. If he took his time answering, then it would be a sure sign of guilt. He wasn't sure why sensei hadn't been informed of his capture, but he was glad. Now, he just needed to maintain his confident facade. It wouldn't do to fuel the man's belief that he'd had a hand in the mishaps from yesterday. Even if sensei was right about it being his doing, he wasn't going to give the man a reason to tack on extra punishments. You can play dumb all you want, Uzumaki, but I know it was you. And thanks to your no-good prank, I had to clean flour off of my entire classroom. I had to clean up the mess you made. But I'm a nice guy, so I'll be lenient. You can spend the rest of the week thinking about what it means to be a serious shinobi. Okay, sensei. Will do, Naruto replied, thoroughly confused as to why sensei was being so nice about it. Moving to walk into the classroom for the second time that morning, he was blocked by sensei's extended arm. Hey, what gives? He asked, looking up at the man looming above him. You can think about being a serious shinobi outside of class, he replied as he pointed down the hallway with his free hand. I don't want to see you again for the rest of this week, Uzumaki. But sensei, we're starting ninja espionage techniques today, Naruto complained. He was really looking forward to learning how to be even sneakier than he was already. Tough. Maybe next time you'll think about your shinobi training before you decide to prank someone, sensei replied before he turned on his heels and entered his classroom, shutting the door in Naruto's face in the process. Outraged, Naruto couldn't believe his ears. He was really being banned from class. And not just one lesson, but a whole week's worth of lessons. He was going to be so far behind Hyuga Haim now. He ought to prank sensei again for that, but Naruto felt the weight of his book. He could do it later after he learned more about his clan. If he wasn't going to learn from class, then he could at least learn something just as useful. And now he didn't need to find extra time to read. Walking to the nearest park, Naruto spotted his favorite tree. Easily scaling it, he sat down and flipped open his book, turning to the section he'd left off at the day before. Chapter 2 was titled, The Wandering Years, and boy did that sound exciting. After the separation of the Senju and Uzumaki clans, the Uzumaki clan chose to wander the world in search of techniques and fuinjutsu. Naruto didn't bother to go back to class until he'd finished the book. Unfortunately, 5 days later, he'd ended up with more questions than answers to the majority of his most pressing issues. Sure, he'd learned a heck of a lot more about history reading just the first volume than all the time he'd spent in class, but history wasn't the reason he'd picked up the book in the first place. No, he'd wanted to learn about clan techniques and the like. It was a little disappointing to come up nearly completely empty on that regard, especially considering how much effort he'd put into making it through the large tome. 5 days was a long time. And he wasn't going to lie, it had tried his patience. However, whenever he'd felt himself about to quit and give up, he'd reminded himself why he was doing this in the first place. He was reminded of his goals and dreams, and that was enough for him to be able to pick himself up, soldier on and finish reading. Naruto had been so sure that if he'd just kept reading, just read one more page, he'd discover the special Uzumaki clan techniques. He'd discover super cool Fuinjutsu techniques and elemental jutsu. All he had to do was keep reading, but he'd read the whole thing and not a single word about jutsu. Maybe there was some mention about special Uzumaki jutsu in the next volume or the one after that, but he didn't think he could skip that much class just to read the whole Uzumaki clan section. Besides, what he really wanted to learn more about was Fuinjutsu, and maybe elemental chakra if he got the chance. Of course it seemed like everyone had some type of elemental chakra, so maybe he'd take a pass on that for now. Yeah, Naruto didn't really need to know elemental chakra, not when he could spend time learning super cool Fuinjutsu instead. After all, only the Uzumaki were prodigies with Fuinjutsu, which meant he would be too. He had to be. Even with his disappointment at the lack of Fuinjutsu information, Naruto enjoyed reading about his clan. It was just too cool to learn about all the awesome things the Uzumakis had done. They'd been involved in so much more than just the founding of Konohagakure. The feats they'd accomplished with seals alone were just too cool to be real. He couldn't wait to try it out himself. He just needed some help, the building blocks so he could get started. So, Naruto had gone back to the library to try to find more details on it. After skimming through all of the other volumes, he still couldn't find any specifics. Naruto sighed heavily in frustration. He couldn't be all that surprised. The other volumes had been specific in their description. They'd been large and precise, but more importantly had not been about Fuinjutsu in general. No, Naruto would have to find a volume with Fuinjutsu in the name for him to find any more information on the subject, which was very unlikely. Heck, the series didn't even go into the Uzumaki's role in the foundation of Konoha until Volume 4. Well, the titles of some of the other volumes had been kind of interesting. He was sure he'd enjoy reading about the Warring States era. Free-range ninja fighting glorious battles just as impressive as some of the great shinobi wars. And he'd been a little tempted to read the Uzumaki clan member volume, just so he could look for his dad, but he really didn't have time for all of that. He was already so far behind Hyuga Haim. The type of pleasure reading that would allow him to enjoy learning more about Uzushiogakure would have to wait at least until he became a genin. No, it would have to wait even longer than that too, if he was to become the awesome shinobi worthy of the Hyuga Haim's friendship. For now he needed answers to more pressing issues. He'd contemplated going back to the library again and looking for a scroll or book on the sealing arts, but dismissed the idea almost immediately. Naruto wanted to know how to do Fuinjutsu. It wasn't very likely that there'd be anything on that in the regular public library. It just seemed too powerful for Gigi to allow a bunch of scrolls like that to be available for just anyone. No, if there was going to be a scroll on it at all, then it would be in the ninja library, but he couldn't get into that one until he was a genin. There was no way Naruto was going to wait 2 years to start working on his Fuinjutsu skills. And even if there was information on Fuinjutsu in either library, he didn't really want to have to read another book that would take him another week to finish just to find out about it. He could be patient when the time really called for it. He just didn't think that he needed to exercise that skill any more than he already had. Well, I could always ask Inu-san about it, Naruto thought as he sat in the branches of what was slowly becoming his tree. But he's normally so busy. He doesn't even have time to play anymore, he pouted as he fiddled with a nearby leaf. Plus, it's always a total gamble that Inu-san will be the one to catch me after a prank, so I guess he's out of the picture anyway. Naruto sighed as he stared up at the blue sky hidden behind the green leaves of his tree. I guess there's only one solution, he mumbled to himself as he hopped from his perch on his tree. It was time to see Jiji. Climbing the stairs of the Hokage Tower, Naruto crossed his fingers. He was going to need all the luck he could get in order to bypass Jiji's rather strict secretary. She didn't normally let him in to see the old man unless it was super important or Jiji had asked for him specifically. Walking with all the confidence he could muster, Naruto made his way down the hallway. If he was lucky, she wouldn't even notice he was there. After all, there had to be some perks to being this short. And where do you think you're going, Uzumaki-san? Jiji's secretary asked, stopping him in mid-step as he approached the old man's office. Well, you see, I just need to speak to Jiji for a couple of minutes, he replied, nervously creeping his way closer to his office. If he could only reach the door, and speak loud enough for Jiji to hear him, he might get away with this. You will do no such thing, she replied sternly. Hokage-sama does not have time for your interruption. He's in the midst of some very important business. Ah, come on. He's just looking over some boring paperwork. That's not that important, he complained as he continued his slow inch towards Jiji's door. Stop right there, Uzumaki-san. I know exactly what you're doing, she accused with a pointed finger. You will not interrupt the Hokage-sama, and that is final. Now run along. Caught. Naruto headed for the stairwell. He knew when he'd lost. It's not my fault. Jiji would rather hang out with the coolest future ninja of all time than do stupid paperwork, he mumbled as he passed her desk. She just gave him a pointed stare as he continued on his way, head down and hands firmly in his pockets. Well, there was more than one way to see Jiji. I guess it's time for Plan B, he thought as he shuffled down the stairs. Although he did promise the old man that he'd try to stay out of trouble, he was just going to have to keep his antics on the small side of the scale. He really didn't want to have to spend too much time cleaning up. That would defeat the whole purpose of skipping the library and heading straight to Jiji. Anyway, it was just going to have to be the price he had to pay. Hopefully Jiji will understand. Desperate times do call for desperate measures after all. Uzumaki-san, by orders of the Hokage-sama you are to stay here to wait for his audience, Hyuga-san stated with the stiff formality familiar to his clan, hand still firmly gripping Naruto's arm. Dangling slightly from Hyuga-san's grasp, Naruto began to complain. He may have been a prankster, but that didn't mean he could be manhandled like a sack of potatoes. Geez, Hyuga-san, you can let me down now. I'm not going anywhere, he huffed. Sometimes he hated doing things the hard way. You've been warned, Uzumaki-san. Do not attempt to escape from punishment, Hyuga-san replied as he loosened his grasp, letting Naruto fall to the floor in an undignified heap. Naruto huffed again. What had he ever done to Hyuga-san to deserve this kind of treatment? Oh man, maybe Hyuga-san had been a part of that group that one time he'd hit the police headquarters. Still, he didn't think blue hair was a good excuse to be mean. It had washed right out, eventually. Yeah, just don't be so rough next time, Hyuga-san, he complained as he headed to his customary seat. They should really think about dedicating this spot to him. You know, get his name engraved in it to commemorate how often he has to sit there. Next time stay in class, Uzumaki-san, Hyuga-san replied before turning to leave, his partner by his side. Their job was done after all. Plopping down into the throne of the totally awesome, he was trying out new names for his chair. Naruto noticed the particularly dirty look Jiji's secretary was throwing him. Uzumaki-san, just because I said you couldn't visit does not mean you should go out and prank some poor shopkeeper just so you can get in here, she admonished, her dark eyes leveled steadily on his form. It was actually kind of scary. Note to self, do not prank Gigi's secretary, he thought as he sank further into the throne of the complete screw-up. At least that's how he felt with her glaring at him. Hokage-sama has too much to do for you to go and pester him whenever you want to, she finished, sending him one more deadly look before turning back to the papers on her desk. Man, I'm going to have to be sneakier about this, he thought as he absent-mindedly swung his legs. He was just short enough that if he sat all the way back his feet wouldn't touch the floor. I think she's on to me, he added before turning back to the door. Hopefully Gigi won't take too long this time. Sarutobi Hiruzen leant back in his chair as he watched a squirming Naruto-kun fidget in the seat across from him. The Sandame took a deep draw from his pipe. Only seconds ago, Naruto-kun had just loudly proclaimed that he wanted to be a master at Fuinjutsu. A master, huh? Hiruzen had expected something like this. Had planned for this moment. He had just hoped that Naruto-kun wouldn't have needed to get into trouble for this conversation to happen. Hiruzen took another long pull of his pipe as he studied the Yondaime's legacy. Gigi, do you think you could help? Naruto-kun asked, weakly, sweat starting to drip off his brow. Hiruzen blew out a long stream of smoke as he considered his options. He didn't want to encourage this attention-seeking behavior, but he did want to give Naruto-kun his best chance. The Sandame had already gone through the trouble to create a very detailed scroll that would help the young boy learn Fuinjutsu. He'd been expecting Naruto-kun to want to learn it. Something about Uzumakis and Fuinjutsu had left little doubt in his mind that Naruto-kun would want to follow in his ancestors' footsteps. But should he now? I don't know, Naruto-kun. I asked you to stay out of trouble, but here you are not even a week later. Skipping class no less. I thought you would take your shinobi career more seriously. I am taking it seriously, Gigi. I only pulled the pranks I could see you. You need only have stopped by Naruto-kun. You know you are always welcome. Naruto-kun grumbled something under his breath, but otherwise said nothing. The Sandame sighed as he took another long draw of his pipe. In times like this, he really needed it. Naruto-kun, the art of Fuinjutsu is not a child's toy. It is for serious shinobi. I know, Gigi, please. It's all I have of my clan. Hiruzen studied Naruto-kun long and hard. His fierce determination reminded him strongly of his mother. Kushina would be so proud. The Sandame sighed again as he opened the drawer to his desk where he'd been keeping the scroll. He'd always been planning to give it to him. He just hoped this wasn't a huge mistake. Tossing the scroll at Naruto-kun, Hiruzen spoke. That will have exercises and information on proper sealing techniques. Naruto-kun jumped out of his seat in excitement. Yada. Thanks, Gigi. There are chakra blocks on the higher level techniques, so you won't be able to get to anything too complex until you're ready. Naruto-kun did a little dance as he moved toward the door. Don't worry, Gigi. I'll have it mastered in no time. And Naruto-kun. Naruto-kun turned back to Hiruzen. Promise me you really will try to stay out of trouble. Promise, Gigi. I don't want to hear about a large increase in mystery pranks either. One prank per new sealing technique, Naruto-kun. Hi, Gigi. No worries, Naruto-kun replied with a large smile on his face. Hiruzen watched Naruto-kun's retreating form. What had he done? More than excited to get started, Naruto couldn't wait to open up the scroll. Rushing out of Gigi's office, he'd practically sprinted to his favorite spot in the park. Plopping down next to his tree, Naruto rolled out the scroll so that he could get to the good stuff at the bottom. Looking expectantly at the end of the scroll, the grin that had yet to leave his face disappeared. The sight of Gigi's neat handwriting a complete disappointment. Naruto-kun, as I told you earlier, you won't be able to access the higher level techniques until you have the proper chakra control. But don't worry, I've included appropriate chakra control exercises to help you get there. Smiley face Gigi. Naruto sighed in frustration. He'd been so close, but of course he should have known better. As Inu-san always said, there were no shortcuts to strength. Naruto rolled the scroll back, hiding the mostly blank parchment so that he could read the first section. It displayed a diagram with a basic stone chakra manipulation exercise. The detailed images were accompanied by an even more detailed explanation, but Naruto didn't bother reading it. There was no way he was going to waste any more time trying to read all of that. Plus, it couldn't be that hard. He already knew how to activate his chakra and the images were pretty self-explanatory. In fact, the exercise looked oddly familiar. Now that he thought about it, Naruto vaguely remembered getting kicked out of class last year when the sensei, Naruto hadn't bothered learning his name either, was teaching this very technique. Then it was settled. This had to be fairly simple if he was already supposed to know it. Besides, Naruto thought as he looked down at the diagram again. It didn't seem that hard. Picking up a small pebble like the ones he remembered the other students using last year, Naruto formed the basic hand sign for chakra release. Immediately the small rock shot off his hand like a mini projectile. Too cool. He declared loudly, already impressed with himself. Clearly he'd mastered the skill, and in less time than he'd thought. Naruto quickly looking back to the scroll for the next section. He wasn't about to waste precious time he didn't have working on a skill he had so obviously mastered. After all, he wanted to learn Fuinjutsu, not chakra control. The only problem was, nothing changed. Nanda, didn't I learn it? Naruto asked himself as he looked back at the image. Unfortunately, looking at the diagram didn't really tell him what had gone wrong. Groaning, Naruto flopped back down. He was actually going to have to read the scroll. Starting from the top, he couldn't help but notice just how many unnecessary words littered the page. Thankfully, it wasn't too complicated so he could simplify the directions fairly easily. 1. Get a small stone. Check. 2. Channel chakra into the stone. Check. 3. Keep stone on palm with only chakra. Jumping up to get another stone, Naruto didn't bother to read further than the first paragraph. He was a man of action, and he'd spent far too much time reading already. Hyuga Haim was already outpacing him. He needed to have this mastered today. Believe it. Picking up a similarly sized pebble, Naruto tried again. Unfortunately, applying chakra only caused the small stone to shot off his hand just as rapidly, if not more so, than the last time he'd tried. Shimada, this is going to take longer than I thought, Naruto complained as he quickly rose from his spot to search for more small rocks. The modest pile of pebbles was soon completely depleted as he tried again and again only to receive the same result. No matter how much chakra he used, he couldn't get the darn stone to stick. Huffing in frustration, Naruto turned his attention back to the scroll. He was going to need to read more than the first paragraph if this was going to work. Well, that makes sense, he thought as he finally read the entire explanation. Too much chakra and the stone shoots off, but I kind of already figured that one. And too little chakra causes the rock to not stick. Yeah, pretty sure I don't have that problem, Naruto thought as he glanced over the instructions once more. There's got to be some kind of trick or something, he continued as his eyes took in the words. Just my luck, he complained. No tricks or tips. Well, isn't that just swell? The only thing he'd noticed was the advanced form of doing the technique on any part of his body and the replacement of the stone with a single leaf. However, he'd need to get the dang thing to stay on his hand first. With no shortcuts in sight, Naruto went to gather more stones. A quick look around his spot and he realized that he wouldn't be finding the pebbles he'd already used. Of course, if he thought about it, it made sense. They'd shot from his hand with some pretty impressive speed. He really wouldn't be surprised if they were a couple miles out from his position. So, without the prospect of easily finding the stones he'd already used, he got to work looking for more. Luck was with him as it only took a few extra minutes to gather a rather large pile of pebbles. Stones in hand, he set back to work. The next 2 hours were spent in rapid concentration as he attempted to keep the small rocks in his open hand. Belly rumbling, he'd felt he had made enough progress to justify taking a lunch break. He figured the 5 feet distance his pebbles were traveling was pretty good progress, all things considering. He was going to stay positive, just as Master Pranking Rule number 28 said. There was no point getting down if he could actually see the progress he was making. So maybe I'm not where I thought I'd be right now, Naruto thought as he moved to his little pack. This is just a small setback, he continued as he pulled out a small pot and a cup of his favorite instant ramen. He'd of course come prepared. I'll have those stones sticking to my hand by the end of the day. Believe it, he finished as he began the process setting up his campfire. It was actually a rather relaxing activity, gathering wood and the proper stones just as Inu-san had taught him. Fire started, Naruto hopped over to the nearby river to fill his little pan. He wasn't looking forward to the long wait for his lunch, but maybe he could make the most of his time. Plopping down to wait, Naruto thought over his situation. Maybe the problem's with the pebbles, he thought as he sat back, leaning into his favorite tree. Maybe it's just not heavy enough, he continued as he gazed up at the sky. Yeah, I should use bigger rocks, he concluded with a casual glance at his heating water. Plus bigger stones are probably more difficult, which means I'll have even better chakra control when I'm done. Decision made, he transferred the hot liquid to his cup noodle to begin the long agonizing 3-minute wait. 5 minutes later found Naruto combing the area for more rocks. Stumbling upon a stone just a little bit smaller than his palm, he picked it up and tried again. Eyes shut tight on the off chance this wouldn't work. He didn't really want to see the damage a rock this size would make. Naruto applied the same amount of chakra he'd been using earlier. Holding his breath he waited. Nothing happened. Opening his eyes, he spotted the stone still firmly in his palm. He'd done it. The slight weight of the rock was perhaps the greatest feeling in the world. Testing out how firmly his chakra held the rock in place, Naruto moved his hand up and down, shaking it a little to see if it would stay. Now came the tricky part. Turning back to the scroll, Naruto infused some of his chakra into it to activate the basic fuinjutsu that should have been below. To his amazement, although he wasn't really surprised he had gotten the chakra exercise to work, more writing appeared on the scroll. Storage seal, Naruto read aloud. Now that sounded useful. Looking behind him at his little campsite, the fire and pot set up and his small bag thrown haphazardly by his favorite tree, he couldn't help to note all the things he'd wanted to bring. Yeah, he had everything he absolutely needed, but if he could bring more, Naruto grinned wickedly. He'd be able to do a lot with a seal like this one. The next hour found him bent at the waist practicing writing the seal. Over and over again, he wrote, not stopping until he'd thought he'd gotten it just right, and then he'd written it again just to make sure. Luckily enough, it was an awful lot like dyeing camouflage paper. Slow and time-consuming, but rewarding nonetheless. He just had to pay attention to the little details and push through even if his hand ached. He had a feeling there would be a lot of sore hands in his future. With everything just right, Naruto didn't waste another minute. Taking the newly drawn seal, he infused a small portion of his chakra into it. He was careful to use just the amount mentioned in the scroll. He really needed to get this right. Holding his breath, Naruto waited for the seal to activate. Boom! Black powder covered his face as the seal promptly exploded. Hair swept back. Naruto blinked. All right, so I don't have this thing mastered like I thought I did, he thought with a heavy sigh. That's okay. Just a minor setback for the greatest future ninja Konoha has ever seen, he continued as he glanced at the overly innocent-looking scroll still lying to his right. Maybe I should go back to the small pebbles, he contemplated, spotting such a stone not more than a foot away from him. Perhaps that was a sign. Rolling his shoulders, Naruto grabbed the rock. Okay, you're about to become my new best friend, he spoke directly to the little pebble, holding it up to his eye level. We're going to get this right even if it's the last thing we do. Believe it, he declared before slipping the stone into his pocket. Having his first attempt at Fuinjutsu blow up in his face was probably enough for a first day. Plus it was getting kind of late anyway. Lumbering over to his pack, Naruto started the process of cleaning up. If this training session was anything to go by, then it was definitely going to be a long week. 2 weeks later, Super Ninja Notes Part 5, Operation Honey and Feathered, Naruto began as he spoke into his small recording device. Inu-san had given him his old one for no particular reason a week ago. He'd simply tossed it at his head before disappearing just as fast as he'd arrived. Naruto had just barely been able to catch it, which was a good thing because he'd been pretty high in the trees of Konoha at the time. If he'd dropped it then, he wouldn't have been able to use whatever survived the fall. Of course, Inu-san could be weird like that, so he wasn't all that bothered. As it was, Naruto had been putting it to good use. He managed to record his successes and temporary setbacks, which at this point was mostly setbacks, but he couldn't complain. He'd finally managed to activate a successful seal earlier in the week, so at this point all seemed to be faring pretty well. And now that he could record his sealing attempts, he could more easily replicate those successes and avoid the setbacks. Now all he had to do was listen to the recording to remember what had worked and what hadn't. It made life a heck of a lot easier, that was for sure. A small pebble was stuck to his forehead as he thoroughly reviewed his plan for Operation Honey and Feathered. 3 kilograms of honey. Check. He'd been saving up honey for the entire week just for this purpose. Dyed camouflage papers. Check. He'd picked out the dyed papers that would work best for the location of his next operation. It hadn't taken long because he'd long ago discovered that having every possible variety available made pranks run the smoothest. There was no point in wasting time when he could make a bunch in his downtime. 10 kilograms of goose feathers. Check. He'd personally plucked every feather. It had taken him a couple days of work, but in the end it would totally be worth it. Ninja wire. Check. He'd been stockpiling ninja wire for his operations for years now, so that hadn't been all that hard to come by. Set up supplies. Check. And everything seems to be in order. Now came the hard part. After Naruto's first failed sealing attempt, he'd spent the next week mastering the chakra control technique. Of course he'd stopped to check his progress, succeeding in creating a very small storage scroll that could barely hold the sealing supplies he'd made it with on his second official try. He hadn't been able to make a seal that could hold much more until his last attempt. So while Naruto had successfully created 2 other storage scrolls, he couldn't be completely sure this seal would hold the large quantity of stuff he had before him. This would be the real test, and he was 113% ready for it. He was counting on this to work, as his prank wouldn't work without it. There was just no way Naruto would be able to carry all the stuff needed to complete the prank without drawing some form of unnecessary attention. Not if he carried it around the village. He was already considered public enemy number 1. He couldn't so much as hum suspiciously without the Hyuga police taking him in for questions. So yeah, this required the utmost care. If his seal didn't work for the real thing, then he'd have to train even harder with the stone chakra exercise. Maybe multiple stones at once, or adding a leaf into the mix. That sounded pretty difficult. Naruto released his chakra and let his pebble fall into his hand. While he was growing quite attached to his little friend, maybe he should start doing that anyway. It couldn't hurt to try. Stuffing the stone into his pocket, he turned back to his seal. It was now or never. First attempt to seal operation supplies, Naruto dictated as he carefully drew his chakra to his hands and onto his perfectly drawn seal. The scroll glowed red before the black ink spread formed the scroll and around his operation supplies. He tried to make the necessary comments as he watched, absent-mindedly speaking into the recorder as he dictated everything that happened. He'd learned pretty quickly that if he didn't say everything that happened in as much detail as possible, then it was a lot harder to replicate it. Watching intently, he nearly jumped into the air in excitement as the objects grew red before disappearing into the scroll. He'd done it. Awesome. Success. He exclaimed into the recorder. He'd probably regret the volume when he listened to it later, but for now he didn't care. Now, before he started to celebrate his success prematurely, Naruto had to make sure he could release it. There was really no point in making a storage seal he couldn't undo. He'd just end up losing all his stuff. Going through the same process, Naruto slowly released the scroll, dictating the process as he worked. In a flash, all of his supplies reappeared in front of him. Release of seal, super successful, he recounted in joy. This was a major accomplishment. After he completed his prank of the century, he was definitely going to treat himself to ramen Ichiraku. Briefly inspecting his supplies to make sure there was nothing missing or broken, Naruto was excited to note that everything looked great. Now was the time to begin. Naruto quickly resealed his supplies and continued with the mission. Operation Honey and Feathers is a go. It was finally time to get that no-good sensei back. No one kicked him out of class for no good reason without suffering the consequences. Day before Genin exams, pacing back and forth in his favorite clearing, Naruto couldn't seem to calm down. He'd been trying to figure out how to do the stupid Bunshin technique for months now, and still he was no closer to a perfect clone than he was then. Well, maybe that wasn't giving himself enough credit. Currently he could make a passable clone, if it didn't move. Shimada, he cursed as he continued pacing. Why won't this work? He questioned aloud. He'd tried everything, from adding as much chakra as he could manage to add it as little as physically possible. Heck, he'd even gone to Iruka-sensei as a last resort and even he couldn't help. This was it, his last chance, his last day to get this right. And for the first time Naruto thought he might actually fail at something. Sure, he'd had setbacks, lots of them. But he'd never outright failed to do anything. He'd always found a way. Squaring his shoulders, Naruto turned to face his flawed clone. There is always a way. Believe it, he declared as he pointed a finger to his near-perfect lookalike. Even if he didn't see it now, he knew there would be a way. For now, he just hoped this imperfect image would be good enough.